Thank you so much for joining us. The President said yesterday that he needs a few more days to get a fuller picture of what's actually happening with coronavirus. The confirmed cases, of course, don't tell the full story. That's sort of 1,700, likely many, many more, but we can't test everyone, and we've only tested some 58,000 people across the country so far. When will we get a real picture of COVID-19? How deep do we have to slice into the various groups across the country?
Good evening, Sally. So I think that our first part of the curve, which appears to have flattened a little since both the declaration of disaster as well as lockdown, and as we've limited movement, and that really appears to have been the curve associated with the imported cases. So those were cases that came into the country from through flights, mainly from international travel, and then infected those closely around them in terms of close contacts. So I don't think that we really have a good picture yet of the community transmission, which we're starting to see. Over half of our cases now are community transmission and no longer associated with travel. And that has been evidenced by the NICD changing the definition for persons under investigation to no longer require a travel history or contact with somebody who has a travel history. So we have a long way to go. We've only really been testing those who have had a travel history up until now. So as we start with the community screening based on symptoms, which are very similar, as you know, to influenza-like symptoms and common cold symptoms, so people may not have been aware that they might have COVID-19.
So people looking at the numbers are actually saying that there are two curves. There's the first curve, which we're kind of dealing with at the moment, people who've come from overseas, who've had links with people who've travelled, and we've got a good picture of that, and it seems to be flattening. But as you say, the community picture, we haven't begun to tell that. How soon will we get a grip on that, do you think?
So in a sense, our president made a difficult but very courageous decision to do the lockdown early. Otherwise, I think we would have been seeing significant increases in community transmission already. But I think as the rollout within the next 2 weeks, as the rollout of the community testing, community screening and testing takes place, we're going to start seeing a much better picture of what we're doing. Remember that we still only have 3% of our tests actually positive cases, and we still have quite a strict definition until now of who gets tested. So that hasn't been bad, except that it's only really been in geographic areas where it's been associated with cases. So now I hope to start seeing a lot better of a picture as we move into areas of dense population as well as areas of informal settlements where we're very concerned that we will have significant increases in cases.
I want to get your comment on something that might be a bit of a ray of light. This BCG vaccine, which is given pretty much by law to give immunity from TB in places like South Africa. There's some talk that, in fact, that helps give immunity from coronavirus. Countries where it's mandatory to give that vaccination, they've had lower death rates. Do you put a lot of store in that? Could that be a ray of hope for South Africa?
So certainly it's something that we must look at. So what has been seen are ecological studies, so very difficult to show any causation through those studies because we haven't eliminated things like confounders, so other things that could be associated with both factors, and that then it's almost like a false connection. But what we have seen is a correlation between countries with BCG, universal BCG vaccination at birth, and lower severity rates of COVID-19 illness. So that means the illness itself is not as severe and the deaths are fewer. So we have a lower mortality rate in countries that have had that. So what's been interesting with that particular correlation is that countries like Iran, who only introduced that universal vaccine in 1984, so therefore only under 35-year-olds have really been vaccinated, is that they actually show a higher mortality currently and a higher severity. So there's still lots of water under the bridge to investigate around this particular correlation or association. It's certainly not causative at this stage, but it certainly is a ray of hope that we could start to look at. Having been on just anecdotally, which as a public health specialist we tend to not look at anecdotally, but certainly having been on the front line of case and contact tracing, I think most of us have been fairly surprised at how mild most of our cases have been. But the vast majority of our cases have been able to be treated at home and had a relatively mild illness. So we're only really starting to see hospital admissions now. And as you know, our deaths are fairly small. We also only saw deaths closer to 1,000 cases versus previously, versus in other countries who saw deaths closer to 100 cases. So that's been a ray of hope, but there's still lots of unknowns in this.
Given all those unknowns, from a health perspective, would you say that our lockdown needs to be extended beyond the last 7 days or so that we've got?
So the only way that we have to prevent this pandemic from spreading is to restrict movement and restrict people getting in touch with each other and therefore spreading from person to person. And we do that through a number of ways. One is ensuring the strict hand hygiene, the respiratory hygiene, and all of those measures. But physical distancing is an incredibly important part of that. A positive case cannot transmit extensively if they don't have contact with a number of other people. So from that perspective, certainly public health-wise, we would be looking to ask for an extension either of lockdown or certainly an extension of restriction of movement. So I think we're going to be heading into a new normal for the rest of the year. I don't see that we're going to be able to return to a normal lifestyle for the foreseeable future. In this year, we're going to have to continue with physical distancing measures, with our strict hand hygiene, et cetera. And I think that the President may be exploring options such as keeping schools and universities closed for a bit longer, as they've all rallied around to try and convert education onto online platforms. Those are two particularly high-risk areas. And then the other is starting to look at a whole other range of mitigation. So whilst people may be able to return to work, to look at splitting shifts so that fewer people are in touch with each other on a basis. Public transport measures, particularly at congregation areas such as waiting areas, taxi ranks, bus terminuses, etc., to really try and spread people out, because that's really the only defences that we have right now. Indeed. Without a vaccine.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate your time. That was Dr. Kerrin Begg, Public Health Medicine Specialist at the University of Stellenbosch.